Good evening. Let's start with what was announced and how it was said, because sometimes the way something is delivered tells you just as much as the substance of the decision itself. Colombia this week formally announced a new set of trade measures directed at its neighbor, Ecuador. The measures were not framed as experimental. They were not framed as exploratory. They were announced as a response. Colombian officials said they are imposing a 30% tariff on 20 products originating from Ecuador. At the same time, Colombia announced that it is suspending electricity exports to Ecuador. Those two actions, taken together, represent a clear escalation in a bilateral trade dispute that has already been unfolding between the two countries. This was not described as a first move. It was described as a reply. Earlier, Ecuador had imposed tariffs of its own on Colombian goods. Colombia's response, according to officials, was designed to mirror that action while also addressing what it called a broader structural problem in the relationship. That problem, as Colombian officials framed it, is an existing trade deficit. Colombia says that deficit currently stands at $850 million. That number was not mentioned casually. It was cited as part of the justification for the measures now being put in place. Officials in Colombia said the tariffs and the suspension of electricity exports are necessary to protect national energy security and to respond to what they described as economic pressure from Ecuador. One Colombian official used the phrase economic aggression. It is a phrase that carries weight, but it was delivered without flourish. It was not followed by threats. It was not paired with timelines for further action. It was used to characterize Ecuador's earlier tariffs and to explain why Colombia says it felt compelled to respond in kind. And yet, even as that language was used, Colombian officials also emphasized limits. They said the tariffs are temporary. They said they are open to negotiation. They said this is not meant to be permanent. Those assurances were included alongside the announcement, not afterward, not as a walkback, but as part of the same statement. So what you have here is a move that is firm, but described as reversible, punitive, but framed as defensive, and importantly, specific. 30% tariffs, 20 products. Electricity exports suspended. No vague categories, no open-ended list, just those measures laid out plainly. At the same time, business leaders in both Colombia and Ecuador responded with concern. They warned about potential economic consequences. They warned about job losses. Those concerns were not tied to hypothetical future measures. They were linked directly to the tariffs and the halt in energy sales that were announced. The concern was immediate. Because trade disputes, even when they are framed as temporary, tend to move faster in practice than they do on paper. Electricity exports, once suspended, are not abstract. Tariffs, once imposed, do not wait for negotiation to begin having effects. And so the reaction from the business community was not about rhetoric. It was about impact. About supply chains, about employment, about costs. Colombian officials acknowledged those concerns without disputing them. They did not deny that there could be economic consequences. They did not deny that jobs could be affected. Instead, they returned to their stated justification: national energy security, the trade deficit, and the need, as they put it, to respond to Ecuador's earlier action. This is where the situation stands at the opening moment. Two neighboring countries, a bilateral trade dispute, reciprocal tariffs, a suspension of electricity exports, and a declaration from one side that the measures are temporary and open to negotiation. One official line, delivered without emphasis, captured the tone of the announcement. This is not where we want to stay. It was short. It was measured. And it underscored the tension at the heart of this moment. Firm action paired with an expressed desire not to let it become permanent. That is the setup. That is the context. And that is where we begin. To understand what comes next, it helps to stay inside the narrow frame of what has actually been said and done, because the details here matter. Colombia's decision to impose a 30% tariff applies to 20 specific products from Ecuador. That number was not expanded upon publicly. Officials did not list the products in the announcement itself, but they emphasized that the scope was deliberate, not blanket, not across the board. This was described as targeted. At the same time, the suspension of electricity exports was presented as a separate but related measure. Colombia exports electricity to Ecuador as part of an existing bilateral arrangement. By halting those exports, Colombia is affecting not just trade balances, but energy flows between the two countries. That is why Colombian officials repeatedly return to the phrase national energy security. They framed the decision not as an economic punishment alone, but as a protective step. In their telling, energy is not just another commodity. It is a strategic resource. And in moments of dispute, they said, strategic resources require different calculations. Ecuador's earlier tariffs, according to Colombia, disrupted that balance. Colombian officials said Ecuador imposed tariffs on Colombian goods first. Those actions, they said, forced Colombia to respond. The response, in their view, needed to be strong enough to signal seriousness, but constrained enough to leave room for talks. That is where the language of temporariness comes in. Officials stressed that the tariffs are not permanent. They stressed that negotiations remain possible. They stressed that the door is open. But they did not attach a deadline. They did not specify conditions for lifting the measures. They did not outline a timeline for talks. Instead, they placed the emphasis on reciprocity. Ecuador acted. Colombia responded. And now, Colombia says, the next move depends on dialogue. Business leaders in both countries listened carefully to that framing, and their reaction was cautious. They warned that even temporary tariffs can have lasting effects. They warned that even short-term suspensions of energy exports can ripple through industries. Manufacturers plan months ahead. Energy contracts are structured around predictability. Jobs are built on continuity. When that continuity is disrupted, even briefly, the consequences do not always reverse cleanly. Those concerns were voiced publicly. They were not dismissed. Colombian officials acknowledged them, but maintained that the measures were necessary. They returned again to the trade deficit, $850 million. That figure was presented as evidence of imbalance, not as an accusation, but as a condition that Colombia says cannot be ignored. Officials described the deficit as unsustainable. They said Ecuador's tariffs compounded the problem, and they said Colombia's response was meant to reset the terms of engagement. The phrase economic aggression appeared again in this context. It was used to describe Ecuador's initial tariffs. It was not followed by inflammatory language. It was not escalated further. But it was also not retracted. It stands as the strongest characterization used so far. And yet, alongside that phrase, there was restraint. Colombian officials did not announce additional measures. They did not threaten broader sanctions. They did not suggest cutting off other forms of cooperation. They stayed within the boundaries of trade and energy. That balance between firmness and limitation is what defines this moment. On the Ecuadorian side, there was no immediate announcement of new countermeasures in response to Colombia's latest actions. The focus, instead, shifted to assessing the impact. Businesses in Ecuador expressed concerns similar to their counterparts in Colombia. They warned about economic consequences. They warned about job losses. They warned that prolonged uncertainty could damage industries that rely on cross-border trade. Those warnings mirror each other on both sides of the border, and that symmetry is striking. Because while governments are framing their actions as defensive and necessary, the private sector is focused on exposure and risk. Tariffs raise costs, energy disruptions affect production, and trade disputes even when labeled temporary, create hesitation. That hesitation can slow investment. It can delay hiring. It can alter supply decisions. None of that requires speculation. It is the immediate logic of uncertainty. Colombian officials, for their part, continued to emphasize openness to negotiation. They said the measures are reversible. They said talks are possible. They said this is not intended to be a permanent state of affairs. One official summarized that position in a line that felt carefully chosen. "We are responding, not closing the door." It was brief. It was calm. And it reflected the tightrope Colombia is trying to walk. Responding strongly enough to assert its position, while signaling that escalation is not the goal. This is where the dispute sits now. Defined actions, defined justifications, public concern from business leaders, and official statements that combine firmness with conditional flexibility. No timelines, no lists of next steps, just a standoff framed as temporary, but unresolved. And unresolved disputes have a way of testing the meaning of words like temporary. So as we come to the close of this account, what matters most is not what might happen next, but what has already been clearly stated and what has not. Colombia has imposed a 30% tariff on 20 products from Ecuador. Colombia has suspended electricity exports to Ecuador. Those are the actions. They were announced openly. They were justified publicly. And they were framed as a response to Ecuador's earlier imposition of tariffs on Colombian goods. Colombian officials have said the measures are necessary to protect national energy security. They have said the measures are tied to an existing trade deficit of $850 million. They have described Ecuador's earlier actions as economic aggression. At the same time, those same officials have emphasized that the tariffs are temporary. They have said negotiations are possible. They have said the measures are not meant to be permanent. That dual message has remained consistent from the start. Firm action paired with stated openness. There has been no expansion of the measures announced so far. No additional sectors have been named. No further restrictions have been introduced. What has been put in place is what has been described, and nothing more. On the other side, Ecuador has not publicly announced new retaliatory measures in response to Colombia's latest decisions. Instead, the immediate reaction has come from business leaders in both countries. They have voiced concern about economic consequences. They have warned about job losses. They have spoken about uncertainty. Those warnings are grounded in the reality that tariffs and energy suspensions affect day-to-day operations. They change costs. They change planning. They change expectations. Those effects begin as soon as the measures take effect, not at the end of negotiations, not at the conclusion of talks, but immediately. Colombian officials have acknowledged those concerns. They have not dismissed them. They have not contradicted them. They have simply returned to their stated reasoning: protection, balance, response. They have repeated that the door remains open. That phrase has appeared more than once. Open to negotiation, open to dialogue, open to resolution, but without a timeline, without conditions, without a schedule. That absence is not accidental. It reflects the current state of the dispute: defined positions, clear actions, and no publicly outlined path forward yet. This is not unusual in trade disputes, but it is consequential. Because in the absence of a timeline, the temporary nature of measures becomes something that must be tested over time. And until that test is resolved, uncertainty persists. Electricity exports remain suspended. Tariffs remain in place. Businesses on both sides adjust as best they can. Jobs are evaluated, costs are recalculated, and governments hold their positions. One line from a Colombian official, delivered without emphasis, captured that posture. This is a response, not an ending. It was short, it was restrained, and it encapsulated the official stance: not final, not irreversible, but real. As of now, that is where things stand. No escalation beyond what has been announced. No retreat from the measures already imposed. No resolution declared. Just a bilateral trade dispute that has moved into a more consequential phase. One defined by tariffs, one defined by energy. One defined by words like temporary and negotiation, used carefully and repeatedly. And until those words are matched by an agreement, the measures themselves remain the clearest expression of the relationship at this moment. They are in effect. They are acknowledged. And they are being watched closely by those whose livelihoods are tied to the flow of goods and power across that border. That is the situation as it has been presented. That is what has been said. And that is where this account comes to a close.